Imagine waking up somewhere in East Africa, roughly 70,000 years ago, and deciding that today is the day you leave. Not leave for a season, not leave to find better hunting grounds of valley, over leave permanently, walking toward a horizon that nobody in your family has ever crossed, with no idea what's on the other side. No idea if there is water in 3 days. No idea if there are people out there who will kill you on sight, or people who don't exist at all yet, in any place you're capable of reaching. Every single step forward is, in the most literal sense, a gamble against death. And at some point, a small group of humans took that gamble anyway. They weren't just traveling. They were, in ways that are only now becoming clear through modern genetics, actively transforming generation by generation into something biologically different from the people they left behind. This is the story of the grit that's quite literally written into your DNA right now, sitting inside every cell in your body, the accumulated biological receipts of tens of thousands of years of humans doing the impossible repeatedly, and somehow surviving it often enough that you exist to hear about it. Let's get into exactly what that grit looked like, because it's stranger, more specific, and more genuinely miraculous than the phrase "humans are adaptable" usually gets credit for. Let's start with the first hurdle standing between our ancestors and literally anywhere else on the planet. Because before you can conquer distance, you have to survive simply being outside for extended periods. And it turns out that's a much bigger problem than it sounds. Heat. The African savanna our species evolved on is one of the most thermally brutal environments on Earth, and every other mammal smart enough to survive there has solved that problem either by staying in the shade during the hottest part of the day or by evolving fur specifically designed to reflect heat rather than trap it. Humans did neither. We are among primates genuinely unusual specifically because we can be active outdoors in direct sun for hours at a stretch, doing something that would put a lion flat on its side. We can run a marathon in the midday heat. Try to find another primate that can say the same thing. You won't. When tagged. The mechanism behind this is a trade that sounds almost too strange to be real once you say it out loud. We lost our fur, and in exchange, we gained somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands spread across nearly the entire surface of our bodies, turning the human body into what's essentially a full-body radiator. Fur is a fantastic insulator, which is exactly the problem because insulation is the enemy of a cooling system that depends on sweat evaporating freely off bare skin. You cannot have both. Evolution picked one, and the one it picked let our ancestors do something genuinely strange on a landscape full of predators built for speed. Anthropologists studying this, working under what's called the endurance running hypothesis, have pointed out that early humans likely didn't outmuscle or outsprint the animals they hunted. They outcooled them. A cheetah can beat a human easily over 30 seconds. It cannot beat a human over 6 hours in blistering heat, because a cheetah cools itself by panting, and panting stops working once an animal is moving fast enough that its breathing gets locked to its running gait. Humans have no such limitation. We just keep sweating, keep moving, and eventually the animal we're chasing collapses from heat exhaustion while we're still walking. This was our first superpower, and it wasn't strength and it wasn't speed. It was endurance, bought at the cost of every hair on our bodies. That solved the heat problem. It did absolutely nothing to prepare our ancestors for what happens when the exact opposite problem shows up thousands of kilometers and tens of thousands of years later on a plateau so high that the air itself becomes the enemy. Let's talk about the Tibetan Plateau, because this is one of the single most jaw-dropping examples of human genetic adaptation that modern science has ever documented, and it involves a plot twist that nobody saw coming until researchers actually sequenced the DNA involved. At altitudes above roughly 4,000 meters, the air contains dramatically less oxygen than what most human bodies evolved to expect, and the standard human response to that thinning air is to compensate by producing more red blood cells, thickening the blood to carry more oxygen per unit volume. That sounds like a reasonable fix until you realize what thick blood actually does at altitude over the long term. It increases the risk of dangerous clotting, strokes, and a serious pregnancy complication called chronic mountain sickness that measurably reduces fertility in populations that rely on this standard low oxygen response for generation after generation. In other words, the body's normal solution to thin air is itself a slow-motion problem if you're trying to live somewhere permanently rather than just visiting. Tibetan populations don't use that standard solution. Researchers studying this, most notably a team led by geneticist Rasmus Nielsen, discovered that Tibetans carry a specific variant of a gene called EPase1 that essentially overrides the normal thicken your blood response. keeping their blood thinner and more efficient at altitudes that would put most other humans at serious medical risk within years of continuous exposure. And here's the detail that turned this from an interesting adaptation story into a genuinely stunning piece of ancient genetic detective work. When researchers traced where this specific version of EPase-1 actually came from, it didn't match anything found in the broader modern human gene pool at meaningful frequency. It matched Denisovan DNA, the extinct human relative known almost entirely from a handful of genetic fragments recovered from a Siberian cave, a population that had no other significant genetic footprint left in most of humanity. At some point deep in the past, ancestors of modern Tibetan populations interbred with Denisovans, inherited this specific altitude-adapted gene variant, and that inheritance is the reason millions of people today can live, work, and raise families at altitudes that would send most humans to a hospital. This isn't just survival. It's a genuine biological gift, passed down from an entirely separate branch of the human family tree that no longer exists anywhere else on Earth, sitting quietly in the blood of people who mostly have no idea their ability to breathe comfortably. Above 4,000 meters comes from ancient interbreeding with a species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. If the mountains demanded thinner blood, the Arctic demanded something almost the opposite, an entire metabolism rebuilt from scratch around a diet that would be nutritionally catastrophic for almost anyone else on the planet. Indigenous Arctic populations, including Inuit communities across the circumpolar north, traditionally survived on diets extraordinarily high in fat and protein from marine mammals, seal, whale, and fish, with almost none of the carbohydrates that make up the bulk of most human diets worldwide. By the standard nutritional logic that applies to most modern humans, a diet that concentrated should produce serious cardiovascular problems over a lifetime. It doesn't, at least not to the degree you'd expect, and researchers studying Inuit genetics have identified specific gene variants, notably in genes that regulate how the body processes fatty acids, that appear to have been strongly selected for specifically in Arctic populations, allowing their bodies to metabolize an extremely high-fat diet in a fundamentally different, more efficient way than populations without that ancestry. Some of this research, including work published by geneticist Rasmus Nielsen's team again, looking at a different population this time, has even connected specific Inuit gene variants back to Denisovan or archaic human ancestry as well, adding the Arctic to the growing list of places where surviving an extreme environment turned out to run directly through inherited DNA from an extinct human relative. Their bodies didn't just find a workaround for a harsh environment. They effectively rebuilt their internal chemistry to turn what should have been a liability, a diet almost entirely fat, into a genuine metabolic advantage, converting that fat into heat with an efficiency that let entire populations thrive somewhere that offers essentially nothing green to eat for most of the year. So biology solved the heat problem, and biology solved the altitude problem, and biology solved the Arctic diet problem. But here's the question that all of that clever adaptation still doesn't answer, and it might be the single hardest one on this entire list, because it's not really a biology question at all, in the same physical sense. Why did anyone keep walking in the first place? Why leave a place where you already know the food sources, already know the dangers, already know how to survive, and push instead toward a horizon where none of that knowledge applies and you might simply die finding out? Every adaptation we've just covered assumes someone already made the decision to go somewhere brutally difficult. None of it explains the decision itself. This is where the story stops being purely physical and becomes at least partly psychological, and it centers on something researchers have somewhat playfully nicknamed the explorer's gene, a specific variant of a dopamine receptor gene called DRD4, specifically the 7-repeat variant, sometimes labeled DRD4-7R in the research literature. This variant has been linked in multiple studies to novelty-seeking behavior and increased risk-taking, and here's the detail that connects it directly back to this entire migration story. Population geneticists have found that DRD47R shows up at meaningfully higher frequencies, specifically in populations whose ancestors undertook longer migration distances compared to populations whose ancestors stayed closer to humanity's original range in Africa. It's important to be honest about the limits of this finding because it's a correlation observed across populations, not a proven mechanism showing this exact gene variant caused any specific individual to pack up and leave. But the pattern itself is consistent and well documented enough that many researchers treat it as a genuinely serious piece of the puzzle. Something in the human genome appears to correlate with a restless pull toward the unknown, a kind of itch that made the risk of the next mountain feel worth taking, even when every rational calculation about known food, known safety, and known survival said stay exactly where you are. Put all four of these pieces together, and you start to see something that looks less like isolated lucky adaptations and more like a coherent, if entirely unplanned, biological strategy for conquering an entire planet. Lose the fur, gain the sweat glands, survive the heat well enough to outlast anything trying to eat you. Keep pushing outward because something in your wiring won't let you sit still even when staying would be safer. Cross into oxygen-starved mountains and, through an ancient encounter with a now-extinct human relative, inherit exactly the genetic tool needed to breathe comfortably, where your own recent ancestors couldn't. Cross into a frozen landscape offering almost nothing to eat except fat, and rebuild your metabolism, sometimes again borrowing genetic material from that same vanished archaic population, until that fat becomes fuel instead of a liability. None of this was planned. None of it was chosen consciously by anyone who understood what was happening at a genetic level, because nobody involved had any concept of genes at all. It happened the way all evolution happens, through generations of people who simply survived long enough to have children, passing forward whatever version of themselves happened to work, one brutal environment at a time. Here's what's worth sitting with as we close this out. Every single one of these adaptations represents a population that could very easily have failed instead. The Tibetan populations without that Denisovan-inherited EPase-1 variant simply wouldn't have thrived at altitude the way they do. The Arctic populations, without their specific fat metabolizing adaptations, would have faced a genuinely brutal nutritional mismatch with their environment, generation after generation. And every population carrying a version of that restless explorer variant that pushed them toward unknown horizons could just as easily have walked into a landscape that killed them outright, leaving no descendants and no genetic trace for anyone alive today to ever find or study. The tree of successful human migration that scientists have reconstructed through modern genetics is by definition a tree built entirely from the branches that survived. Every failed attempt, every group that pushed into new territory and simply didn't make it left nothing behind for anyone to trace. No percentage on an ancestry report, no gene variant for a modern researcher to identify. You are looking, whenever you look at any of this evidence, at survivors only, the accumulated, unbroken result of an almost unimaginable number of individual gambles that happen to pay off generation after generation. For 70,000 years, you are the result of 70,000 years of successful gambles. Every lost hair follicle, every borrowed Denisovan gene, every restless genetic itch that wouldn't let someone sit still, all of it got passed down layer by layer until it became you. We didn't just populate this planet, we conquered it through an accumulated series of biological miracles that nobody alive at the time understood they were creating. So the next time you feel like you can't go on, it's worth remembering that grit isn't just a metaphor for you. It is, quite literally, sitting in your blood right now, put there by people who had every reason to stop and simply didn't.